set to go into effect on August 1st.
We both agree that it is essential to respect the USMCA trade agreements, and we shared our experiences about the letter we received from President Trump.
Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum said on Wednesday that she and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney had agreed to strengthen trade collaboration, particularly in light of the tariffs from U.S. President Donald Trump.
They received a letter with 35% tariffs, and we received one with 30%.
Sheinbaum said she and Carney spoke about the strategies both countries were taking to negotiate with the Trump administration ahead of the August 1st deadline.
So Grumpy Trumpy thought a 35% tariff was his magic wall against Canada and Mexico. But guess what? While Donnie was waving his tariff stick, Ottawa and Mexico City started building something way bigger.
Our Foreign Affairs Minister, along with our Finance Minister, are in Mexico for talks with that country's president, as well as Canadian and Mexican business leaders. The focus? Economic cooperation, supply chains, and trade infrastructure. After failing to strike new trade deals with the U.S., officials from Canada and Mexico are meeting this week in a bid to strengthen trade ties between our two countries. So, what do you see as the primary objectives for Canada at these high-level meetings in Mexico?
Well, first of all, this meeting matters. This is a really calculated strategic moment for the Mexicans and for the Canadians.
An entire energy corridor that dodges the U.S. altogether. Ports, pipelines, long-term financing. They're putting all the Lego pieces together. But the twist? This isn't just political payback. It's a masterclass in protecting themselves from America's mood swings. Stick around. You'll want to see how Plan B could make Trump's big tariff gamble look like a very expensive oops. Quick favor before we move on. If you appreciate this content, consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel. Believe it or not, more than 92% of viewers haven't subscribed yet. It's free and only takes a second, but it means the world to us. So, did you subscribe already? Great. Thank you so much for your support. Now, back to the video.
Canada and Mexico themselves have about $50 billion in two-way trade, so that's nothing to sneeze at. And that's a growing partnership, by the way, and it's not just economic, it's diplomatic. And while Mexico secured a 90-day pause and Canada didn't, the mood in Washington isn't just hostile, it's highly unpredictable. And so both sides need to sort of get together and figure out what the hell's going on. But more importantly, both countries are contending right now with these unilateral emergency tariffs under IEEPA, under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, imposed by the Americans.
Imagine trying to block your neighbors with a giant toll booth, only to watch them draw up blueprints for a shiny new bypass and start digging the next morning. That's basically what happened here. Grumpy Trumpy puffed up his chest, waved his little tariff club, and told Canada and Mexico they'd face a 35% price hike if they sent goods into the U.S.
On Tuesday, Sheinbaum said Mexico will take action if an agreement with the U.S. is not reached by that deadline.
Remember that we have a meeting scheduled for August 1st, and we hope to reach an agreement.
Frankly, the atmosphere foundationally is toxic. Dialogue is stalled. The U.S. administration has opted for power plays over partnership. Ottawa is left waiting while Washington uses these emergency tariffs.
Well, Barry, do any of these deadlines mean much legally, or are they more of a political marker, would you say?
Well, there's absolutely no law here. I'm a law professor, so I like law, but we don't have any.
He thought it would scare them into lining up like kids at recess. Instead, Ottawa and Mexico City looked at each other, shrugged, and said, "All right then, let's stop playing in his sandbox and build our own playground." The 35% tariff threat didn't show up out of nowhere. The talk started making noise in the first quarter of that year, with Donnie Diapers bragging about how tough he'd be on bad trade deals. It was meant to be his proof of dominance, his big alpha move. The shock came after, when instead of panicking, Canadian and Mexican trade officials began quietly booking flights, holding joint meetings, and pushing forward talks they'd been tiptoeing around for years. By summer, the pattern was obvious. They weren't waiting to see if the tariffs would stick. They were drafting a Canada-Mexico energy trade roadmap before the ink on Trump's tweets was even dry.
To bypass the normal dispute channels. So regular deadlines don't really count. It really what counts is what's going on with the president. And that's really very significant for the Mexicans and for the Canadians.
Worked on landmark NAFTA disputes. So can you explain what an investor-state dispute settlement is? Is that relevant here at all? And given the evolving trade landscape, how do you see ISDS mechanisms changing in future deals?
They're both being affected by the same disease. And that's a real problem for us, for the markets, for Canadian citizens, and for consumers.
Now here's the part the orange turd probably didn't notice. The USMCA deal, the one he bragged about like it was the crown jewel of his presidency, has a review date baked in, 2026. That means in just a few years, the three countries sit back down and open the whole agreement again. Canada and Mexico did the math. They had a short runway to lock in joint projects, rewire supply chains, and make sure that if the US turned hostile again, they wouldn't be scrambling. Tariff talk didn't scare them. It sped up their clock. Publicly, officials kept their language polite. They said words like diversification and long-term planning so they wouldn't set off any diplomatic meltdowns.
There is investor-state dispute settlement for the Mexicans against the U.S., and there may very well may be a large number of disputes later on. Now, well, first of all, the what we call the CUSMA, what the Americans call the USMCA and the Mexicans call the TMEC, it took out investor-state dispute settlements for Canada and the United States that arise. But right now, nobody is using any of the dispute processes. And the reason foundationally is that things are moving so quickly, and the United States really isn't following international law. The WTO mechanism itself is broken.
Behind closed doors, it was all about survival. Revenge is just bad PR. Insurance is smart business. The point wasn't to hurt the US, it was to make sure one man's tantrum in Washington couldn't derail billions in trade overnight. The bypass wasn't just a dream, it was their best bet to keep trucks, tankers, and trains moving no matter how many times Donnie whipped out a Sharpie map of his brand new tariff wall. And something strange happened. The roles flipped. For decades, the narrative was that Canada and Mexico were the small players who had to dance to America's tune. Suddenly, they were making the first moves, laying the board out for the next decade while the supposed leader was too busy arguing over crowd sizes and golf scores. Journalists noticed the shift, analysts noticed the shift, and investors really noticed it. The underdogs were suddenly running plays that made the US look like the one chasing the ball. By the time the first tariff drafts were circulating on Capitol Hill, investment patterns were already changing. LNG developers were calling Mexican officials instead of US ones. Canadian energy companies were exploring non-US financing deals. Infrastructure bonds linked to cross-border projects without US stops were selling, and they weren't short-term gambles either. They were the kind of long-haul commitments you make when you're sure the market will be there in 10 years. Tariffs or no tariffs. This wasn't theory. Money was literally moving away from US-dependent trade before the tariffs even landed. So that big, blustery tariff wall, it worked like a flashing neon sign saying, "Time to diversify." And Canada and Mexico didn't just see it. They followed it straight to the bank. Trump can claim it was about protecting America, but what it really did was push his neighbors to speed-run a partnership that cuts the US out of the middle. Not out of spite, but because when the climate's this unpredictable, you build a road that doesn't go through the storm. And that road is starting to look very real. Ports being retrofitted, pipelines being redirected, financing being lined up for decades instead of quarters, all while the US is still busy arguing over whether tariffs should be 35% or 40%. Canada and Mexico are setting the rates and routes themselves, which is exactly where we're heading next. Into the hard infrastructure and financial firepower that makes their bypass more than just talk. Ever seen a chess player suddenly roll out the queen when everyone assumed they were just shuffling pawns around? That's what Canada and Mexico just did. Everyone was watching Trump fuss over his imaginary tariff wall. And meanwhile, these two were moving the real game pieces, ports, pipelines, and LNG terminals into place. This isn't some shiny press release. It's steel, concrete, and a lot of very strategic welding. Let's start with Mexico, because they're not just fixing ports, they're basically turning them into escape hatches for trade. On the Pacific coast, upgrades are making it faster and cheaper to get cargo onto ships headed straight for Asia, skipping US-controlled routes entirely. Over on the Atlantic, they're boosting capacity so energy shipments can cross to Europe without touching an American customs dock. That means if Grumpy Trumpy, or anyone else in Washington, decides to throw a fit, tankers from Mexican ports still leave on time, bills of lading still get signed, and buyers don't panic about delays. They're building what you could call tariff safety valves, except these ones are made out of cranes and dock space instead of political speeches. Canada's moves look a little different, but they're aimed at the same result. Inland transport links, highways, rail lines, are being tuned up so goods can move faster from oil fields and refineries straight to non-US ports. They're modernizing oil terminals, so loading schedules aren't disrupted by the latest mood swings out of Washington. It means that whether the cargo is heavy crude, refined product, or LNG, it's shipped on a reliable clock with backups ready if one route gets blocked. This kind of investment isn't flashy, but it saves millions when weather, politics, or both try to mess things up. Then there's the pipelines. Canada's quietly reworking its network so energy can flow toward alternate export points, instead of just pouring south into the US system. The result? More sales channels outside America, and a clear signal to suppliers that North America's energy game has more than one default setting. If the US starts slapping tariffs around, these channels give Canada and Mexico the flexibility to reroute instead of getting squeezed. Of course, steel and concrete don't pay for themselves, and this is where the Maple 8 come in. These aren't some tech bros with startup dreams. They're Canada's mega pension funds, billions in patient capital run by managers who think in decades, not news cycles. When the US starts shaking markets with random trade threats, this kind of money is the difference between we had a plan and we had to cancel everything. The Maple 8 write the big checks for energy terminals, port dredging, and new transport hubs without needing quick returns. That patience buys stability, and stability means predictable timelines and prices for everyone tied into this corridor. Why does patient capital matter so much here? Because when investors think Washington might toss tariffs around like confetti at a birthday party, short-term funding dries up. No one wants to pour cash into infrastructure that could be strangled by next month's political stunt. But pensions? They keep moving because they're thinking in 30-year horizons. Maple 8 money acts like a shock absorber against US policy swings, keeping work on schedule and prices steady, even when headlines try to spook the markets. And make no mistake, the combination of Mexican port expansions and Canadian inland and pipeline overhauls is a power shift. This isn't just building stuff for the sake of it. Whoever controls the actual flow of energy in North America, where it gets loaded, how it travels, which buyers can access it, controls a huge chunk of the economic leverage. That leverage is quietly tilting away from a US monopoly toward a more balanced triangle, one where Mexico and Canada aren't stuck waiting for the orange turd to sign off on trade like he's the lunch monitor. Long-term, these port cranes, tracks, loading arms, and pension-backed deals lock in something much bigger than the hardware. They lock in predictable energy trade that can survive election drama and tariff tantrums. They create what amounts to a physical and financial pipeline of independence, one you can't dismantle with a press conference or a tweet. And while Trump might still think tariffs are the ultimate weapon, what's coming next could make them almost pointless. Because when you know the trade rulebook better than the guy trying to punish you, you can turn his own moves against him without ever throwing a punch. What if the big, scary tariff you keep bragging about only works if the other guy agrees to play by your rules? That's the part Grumpy Trumpy either didn't know or didn't bother to read. Hidden in the USMCA, the deal he paraded around like it was his personal masterpiece, are these things called rules of origin. They might sound boring, but they're basically the fine print that decides whether a thing is from a certain country. And here's the kicker. If you know how to work those rules, you can make a tariff vanish without ever asking permission. Most people think it's simple. Canadian oil shipped through Mexico is still Canadian oil, right? Well, no, not always. Under USMCA, if what you send gets actually transformed in the other country, new processing, conversion from raw to refined, real industrial changes, it can start wearing a brand new origin tag. And if that new tag belongs to Mexico instead of Canada, US tariffs aimed at Canadian goods suddenly don't stick. It's like watching Donnie Diapers try to lock the front door while you quietly walk in through the garage. But here's where it gets tricky. This origin change doesn't happen just because you moved the barrel from one pipeline to another, or slapped it into a different tanker. US Customs isn't that dumb. They check for real transformation. Take raw Canadian LNG as an example. If it's piped straight to a Mexican port and loaded onto a ship, still Canadian, still hit with the tariff. But if that LNG passes through a modernized Mexican facility that compresses it differently, blends it with locally sourced gas, or even reconfigures it into other petrochemical products, boom, it's now Mexican in the eyes of trade law. No tariff, no fight. All legal. Screw that up though, and the penalties are a headache nobody wants. We're talking refunds demanded after the fact, shipments stuck in limbo, and companies bleeding money because they thought a little repackaging counted as transformation. There's nothing like spending millions to avoid tariffs and then getting smacked with them, plus fines, because some customs official ticked the wrong box. That's why Ottawa and Mexico City have been getting their lawyers, trade experts, and paperwork teams in sync. This corridor plan isn't just about steel and ships, it's about making sure every single shipment has the right legal DNA before it leaves. And here's where the infrastructure part from earlier becomes the secret weapon. All those new Mexican port upgrades, not just for loading more ships. They're being built with the tech and gear to actually carry out the transformations that flip a product's origin status. Same with the energy facilities and processing plants. Some are being designed specifically to meet the threshold definitions in USMCA's fine print. In other words, they're spending upfront to guarantee their stuff clears the rules on day one. The financing side matters here too. Remember the Maple 8 from Canada? Patient pension money is perfect for this kind of long game. You don't see a return tomorrow, but 5 or 10 years down the road, you have a fully operational network that turns Canadian energy into tariff-proof Mexican exports like clockwork. Add Mexico's own investment incentives and co-owned facilities, and now you have a system built to dodge tariffs while looking like nothing more than normal trade activity. The beauty, or the insult depending on your view, is that none of this requires another big public fight with Washington. Trump can scream about unfair deals, but as long as Canada and Mexico are playing inside the USMCA's rules, there's no case. The orange turd basically gave them the playbook when he signed the agreement, and now they're using it to run the ball straight around him. In a trade war, yelling about how tough you are doesn't matter if the other side actually read the manual. Canada and Mexico aren't just building a supply chain. They're designing it so the tariff threat is more like an empty water gun. And the more they layer in these rule of origin tricks, the harder it becomes for the US to use tariffs as a hammer without rewriting the whole agreement. Which brings us to the bigger question. If this strategy works at scale, what happens to America's leverage in North American trade? Because every shipment that slips past US tariffs without breaking a law isn't just a win for Canada and Mexico, it's a small shift in the economic center of gravity. And if those shifts keep stacking up, the US might find itself staring at a network it no longer controls, wondering when exactly the board got flipped. So here's the punchline. Trump's mighty tariff wall might not just fail, it could actually glue together a stronger, more independent North American trade triangle. Just not in the way the orange turd pictured it. The real question now isn't if Canada and Mexico can go around the US. They already can. It's whether the US decides to join a balanced network or sit outside watching it grow. So Grumpy Trumpy thought 85% tariff was his magic wall against Canada and Mexico. But guess what? While Donnie was waving his Ottawa and Mexico